I had not planned to be in the forest that evening. It was supposed to be a short walk, a way to clear my mind before returning to Daniel, my partner of 7 years. Lately, our relationship had felt more like an arrangement than a romance, two men orbiting each other in the same apartment, bound by habit rather than hunger. Daniel was kind, dependable, and steady, but steadiness can become suffocating when it replaces passion. I craved something I couldn't name, a spark that routine had quietly extinguished. The forest stretched just beyond the edge of town, a place I had visited often in my youth but rarely in recent years. Its trees, tall and ancient, formed a canopy that dimmed the last of the daylight, cloaking the path in shadow. With each step, the sound of traffic faded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot and the faint call of distant birds. I inhaled deeply, the earthy scent of pine and damp soil filling my lungs. For a while, I felt almost free, as if I had left my life behind at the trailhead. I was lost in thought when it happened. A sudden grip closed around my wrist, firm and unyielding. My body stiffened, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned, expecting danger, but what I found was a pair of startling green eyes staring into mine. A young man stood there, his hair dark and tousled, his expression unreadable yet charged with intent. His grip tightened, not painfully, but with the kind of certainty that left no room for protest. "Don't scream," he said softly, almost playfully, as though he knew I wasn't going to. His voice carried an edge, but there was no menace in it, only a strange, electrifying confidence. I swallowed hard, torn between fear and curiosity. "What are you doing?" I managed, though the words sounded weaker than I intended. He tilted his head, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "I could ask you the same. Wandering here alone in the dark? Almost like you were waiting for someone." The accusation, or was it an observation, unsettled me. I should have pulled away, demanded release, turned back toward town. Yet his hand was warm against my skin, grounding me in a way that felt alarmingly intimate. I realized with a start that I wasn't struggling to escape. "My name's Adrian," he continued, loosening his hold just enough to let me breathe, but not enough to let me go. "And you are—" I hesitated. Revealing my name felt like surrender, but lying seemed impossible under his gaze. "Michael," I said finally, my voice quieter than before. "Michael." He rolled the syllables slowly, as if tasting them. "Good. Now, why don't you walk with me?" It was less a suggestion than a command, yet something inside me obeyed. Perhaps it was the reckless part of me, the part that had been suffocated under years of predictability with Daniel. Or perhaps it was the way Adrian's eyes seemed to see through me, stripping away the polite mask I wore in daily life. Whatever it was, I found my feet moving, my body following his lead deeper into the forest. We walked in silence at first. The air grew cooler, the shadows thicker, and with every step the outside world receded. My pulse gradually steadied, though my thoughts whirled in chaotic circles. Who was this man? Why had he chosen me? And why did I feel, against all reason, that I wanted to stay? Adrian broke the silence. "You look like someone carrying a secret," he said. "Am I wrong?" His words struck a nerve. I glanced away, unwilling to admit how much truth they carried. Daniel had never asked me questions like that. Daniel had never made me feel exposed. "You don't even know me," I replied. "Not yet," Adrian said, simply, his smile deepening. There was no threat in his tone, but there was no escape in it either. It was as though the forest itself had closed around us, sealing us into a space where choices blurred and desire outweighed reason. By the time we reached a clearing, the last of the daylight had slipped away. The sky above was a dark velvet scattered with stars, their light faint through the branches. Adrian finally released my wrist, only to step closer, his presence filling the space between us. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered, his words both a dare and an invitation. My breath caught. Logic screamed at me to refuse, to turn back, to remember Daniel waiting at home. But the silence of the forest wrapped around us, and in that silence, I felt something stir inside me, a hunger I hadn't known in years. I should have walked away. Instead, I nodded, and with that single gesture, I surrendered to the night. The clearing was small, ringed by trees that seemed to guard it from the outside world. A thin carpet of moss cushioned the ground, and the faint glow of moonlight filtered through the branches above. It felt hidden, forbidden, as though it had been waiting for us. Adrian dropped onto the moss with careless ease, stretching out his legs and leaning back on his hands. He looked at me like I was the one who had entered his world rather than the other way around. "Sit," he said, his tone casual but commanding. I obeyed, lowering myself beside him, though not too close. The air was cool, and I could feel the heat of his body, even from a short distance. My mind screamed with questions. Why was I here? Why wasn't I leaving? But my body seemed content to remain still. Adrian turned his head, studying me in silence for a moment before speaking. "You don't smile much, do you, Michael?" His observation cut deeper than I expected. I laughed lightly, though it sounded hollow. "I smile enough." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You look like a man who forgot how." I wanted to argue to dismiss him, but the truth in his words settled into my chest like a stone. Daniel never accused me of unhappiness. He preferred to believe stability equaled contentment. Adrian, in only minutes, had seen what Daniel had ignored for years. Maybe I don't have much reason to. I admitted, surprising myself. Adrian's expression softened, and for the first time his confidence gave way to something gentler. "That's a waste. A face like yours shouldn't be wasted on silence." The compliment struck me harder than it should have. Daniel's affection had always been understated, practical. He loved me, yes, but rarely did he look at me as though I were something rare. Adrian's gaze was filled with that intensity, and it left me unsettled, unmoored. We talked for a while, the kind of conversation that doesn't feel like talking at all, but rather like peeling back layers. Adrian asked questions no one else dared, about my fears, my frustrations, the nights I lay awake, wondering if this was all there was. In return, he offered fragments of himself. That he thrived on risk, that he couldn't bear the thought of living quietly, that he needed to feel the world pressing back when he touched it. With every answer, the tension between us grew. It wasn't only attraction, it was recognition, a dangerous mirroring of what I had long buried. At some point, Adrian shifted closer. His knee brushed mine, a deliberate contact that sent a current up my spine. I should have pulled back, but I didn't. The night wrapped around us like a cocoon, shutting out the weight of responsibility, the memory of Daniel waiting at home. "You feel it too," Adrian said, quietly, not a question but a statement. I met his gaze, unable to deny it. "Yes." The admission hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. My chest tightened with guilt, but alongside it pulsed something sharper, desire, alive and insistent. Adrian reached out, his fingers grazing the back of my hand before curling around it. His touch was deliberate, patient, as though he knew the war waging inside me. "Stay," he whispered. "Just tonight. Forget everything else." The words pierced through my hesitation. Forget everything else. Could I? For one night, could I silence the voice of reason, the ties of loyalty, the chains of routine? The forest seemed to lean in, listening, as though the trees themselves awaited my answer. I glanced down at our joined hands, then back at his face, lit faintly by moonlight. He looked both reckless and sincere, a paradox I couldn't resist. I squeezed his hand, a silent agreement. Adrian smiled then, slow and satisfied, and pulled me closer until the space between us vanished. My heart pounded, not just from anticipation, but from the terrifying knowledge that there was no going back. Above us, the stars glittered like witnesses. Inside me, the hunger I had denied for so long finally stirred awake, and as Adrian's breath brushed against my skin, I knew the night was no longer mine to resist. Morning crept into the clearing slowly, as though reluctant to intrude on what had transpired. The forest, which only hours before had been cloaked in secrecy, now revealed itself in unforgiving detail, branches outlined against the pale sky, dew clinging to every blade of grass. I stirred, my body heavy, my mind heavier still. Adrian lay beside me, one arm draped across his chest, his expression calm, unbothered. He looked as though he belonged here, part of the wilderness itself, while I felt like an intruder in both the forest and my own life. For a moment, I allowed myself to watch him. His youth was unguarded in sleep, his lips parted slightly, his breathing steady. There was no regret etched into his features, no second-guessing. I envied that ease, that ability to take without apology. But regret had already begun its slow climb inside me. I sat up, brushing pine needles from my clothes, the reality of the world beyond these trees pressing harder with every heartbeat. Daniel's face rose in my mind, his familiar eyes, the quiet steadiness I had abandoned the night before. The thought of walking back through our shared doorway felt unbearable, yet inevitable. Adrian stirred at my movement, opening his eyes. He studied me briefly before speaking. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. I swallowed, unable to meet his gaze. "I have to." He pushed himself upright, his posture relaxed, almost dismissive. "Of course you do. Men like you always do." The words stung, though part of me knew they were true. "I didn't plan this," I murmured, though it sounded like a weak defense. Adrian smirked faintly. "Nobody ever does. That doesn't make it less real." I turned to him then, searching for anger or bitterness in his eyes, but there was none. He looked at me as if I were a passing storm, brief, intense, and already fading. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing," he said simply. "You've already given me what I wanted. A night where I wasn't alone. A night where you weren't either." His honesty left me with no room for argument. I wanted to believe it was more, that I had meant something greater to him, but perhaps that was just another lie to soften the edges of betrayal. I rose to my feet, the weight of departure pulling at me. The forest no longer felt like sanctuary, it felt like judgment. Each step toward the trail was heavy, as though the earth itself resisted letting me go. Adrian didn't follow. His voice reached me from behind, steady and unyielding. "Michael, remember this. You wanted it. Don't pretend you didn't." The truth of his words struck deeper than any accusation. I paused, but didn't look back. To turn would be to unravel, and I couldn't afford that. The walk home felt endless. The forest stretched wider, darker, as though reluctant to release me. My mind replayed fragments of a night, his laughter, his touch, the startling clarity in his eyes. Each memory clashed against the image of Daniel waiting in the kitchen, pouring coffee into his favorite mug, unaware of the fracture forming beneath the surface of our life. When I finally reached the edge of town, the sounds of traffic and distant voices jarred me back into the ordinary. My legs ached, my chest burned with the weight of silence. Stepping through our apartment door, I found Daniel exactly as I imagined, seated at the table scrolling through his phone, a mug in hand. He looked up, smiled faintly, and asked if I'd slept well. His voice was steady, trusting. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. Words of confession hovered on my tongue, but they dissolved before reaching air. Instead, I crossed the room, kissed his temple, and sat opposite him. The gesture felt both intimate and foreign, as though I were playing the role of myself. Daniel spoke of mundane things, the weather, his work schedule, a friend's upcoming birthday. I responded where needed, my mind half here, half still tangled in the forest. As his voice filled the room, I realized the true betrayal wasn't just in what I had done with Adrian, but in the part of me that had awakened and refused to go silent again. I lifted my eyes to Daniel, searching for cracks, for some sign he sensed the change. He only smiled softly, unaware. The forest was behind me, but its shadow lingered, stretching long into the space between us. And in that silence, I knew the hardest part had only just begun. Days passed, yet the memory of Adrian clung to me like smoke, impossible to wash away, even as I tried to immerse myself in routine. Daniel remained steady, affectionate in his quiet way, unaware of the fracture widening beneath us. He would brush my hand at dinner, ask about my work, and speak of small plans for the weekend. I responded, smiled when required, But my thoughts wandered elsewhere, back to the forest, back to the night that had unsettled everything I thought I knew. It wasn't only Adrian's touch I remembered, though that lingered with maddening intensity. It was his words, blunt and unflinching. You wanted it. Don't pretend you didn't. The truth in them refused to loosen its grip. For the first time in years, I had felt alive, not merely existing, but consumed by something larger than myself. That fire was intoxicating, even as guilt hollowed me out from the inside. One evening, as Daniel prepared dinner, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. My face was the same, but my eyes betrayed me, haunted, restless, carrying a secret they could not conceal. Daniel noticed nothing, or perhaps chose not to. He asked if I could set the table, his voice calm, ordinary. The simplicity of it felt unbearable. Later, in bed beside him, his breathing deep and steady, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My body remained motionless, but my mind roamed wild paths through memory and possibility. The night, with Adrian replayed in fragments, his green eyes, his reckless honesty, the dangerous comfort of his presence. I wondered if he was still out there, wandering the forest, waiting for the next man reckless enough to follow. The thought filled me with both dread and longing. The following afternoon, I found myself near the forest again. I hadn't planned it, but my steps carried me there as though pulled by some invisible thread. The trees loomed, unchanged, indifferent to the turmoil they had witnessed. I stood at the edge of the trail, debating whether to enter. Part of me craved another encounter, while another part feared what it would mean if I sought him out. Michael. The sound of my name snapped me from my thoughts. I turned sharply to find Daniel standing a few paces behind me, his brow furrowed. He held a grocery bag in one hand, his posture tense. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. For a moment, I was frozen. The forest loomed on one side, Daniel on the other, and I felt caught between two lives. "Just walking," I said, my voice unsteady. Daniel studied me longer than usual, his eyes narrowing slightly. It was the first time I wondered if he sensed something. He nodded slowly, though I could tell he didn't quite believe me. "Come home," he said simply, and turned back toward the street. I hesitated before following, my chest tight. His words had sounded ordinary, but beneath them I heard something deeper, an invitation, a warning, perhaps even a plea. That night, Daniel reached for me. His touch was familiar, yet unfamiliar, as though he, too, sensed the distance and was trying to close it. I let him, but my body betrayed me. My mind conjured images of Adrian instead. The shame of it twisted inside me, but I couldn't stop. When Daniel fell asleep, I slipped quietly from the bed, pacing the living room in the dark. The walls felt close, suffocating, as if the apartment itself demanded honesty. I pressed my palms to my face, fighting the urge to confess everything. Yet the words stuck, heavy and immovable. To tell him would shatter us. To remain silent would eat me alive. I opened the window, the night air rushing in cool and sharp. Somewhere beyond the town, the forest waited, silent and patient. I knew then that my story with Adrian wasn't over. Whether by chance or by choice, the paths we had crossed once would cross again. And when they did, I would no longer be able to pretend it was an accident.